May 24, 1940. German panzers idle just miles from the coast. They are close enough to finish the job. The British Expeditionary Force is pinned against the sea. They are trapped on a shrinking strip of sand with nowhere to run. General Lord Gort's exhausted men have just fought a brutal, desperate retreat across France. Now, their backs are against the churning waters of the English Channel. The beach is a death trap. It is a massive shooting gallery waiting for the trigger to be pulled. Then, the engines quiet down. The advance stops. That single, baffling pause gives Britain a desperate window. It isn't a window to fight back. It is a fleeting, nearly impossible chance to save its army from annihilation. Lose the BEF, and Britain wakes up to a different war. Over 338,000 men were ultimately pulled from those beaches during Operation Dynamo. We now remember it as the Miracle of Dunkirk. But without that evacuation, the historical timeline shatters. Remove that rescue. Wipe those men off the board. Britain's primary fighting force ceases to exist. The professional core of the British military is gone. London is left empty-handed, staring down a triumphant, battle-hardened Nazi empire. This legendary halt wasn't a sudden bout of German hesitation. It wasn't a rare act of mercy. The order came on the heels of a relentless sprint across Western Europe. The panzers had outrun their supply lines. They left the slower-moving horse-drawn infantry miles behind in the dust. Fuel was critically low. Ammunition was running dry. Repair crews were stretched to the breaking point. Worse still, the marshy, canal-crossed ground around Dunkirk was notoriously bad terrain. It was famous for swallowing heavy tanks in thick mud. Still, the Allied perimeter shrank by the hour. Army Group A's armor, under the command of Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt and Blitzkrieg architect Heinz Guderian, was coiled and ready to strike. Guderian was practically begging his superiors to let him loose. He paced his command post. He was confident his elite panzer divisions could crush the pocket before the British could organize a proper retreat. But Hitler ordered a halt. Hermann Göring arrogantly promised his Luftwaffe could finish the job from the air. That single decision bought the Allies a fleeting window of survival. Göring's boast was an operational miscalculation. The Luftwaffe was tasked with executing the trapped Allied army, but the German Air Force was physically exhausted. Pilots and crews had been flying relentless, back-to-back sorties for weeks across France and the Low Countries. Maintenance was falling behind. Many of their newly acquired forward airfields were little more than cratered dirt strips. They were disorganized and far removed from reliable supply depots. When German bombers finally reached the coastline, they encountered unforeseen environmental defenses. The soft, deep sand of the Dunkirk beaches acted as a blast damper. When high-explosive bombs slammed into the dunes, the sand absorbed the concussive shockwaves. It smothered the deadly shrapnel. Worse for Göring, the Royal Air Force was operating from bases just across the English Channel. Squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambled from southern England. They tore into unescorted Stuka dive bombers, fiercely contesting the skies over the evacuation zone. Göring had promised Hitler an easy slaughter. The reality was a brutal aerial slugfest. It was only a delay of a few days. But in the spring of 1940, a few days meant the difference between national survival and unconditional surrender. Without that pause, the German blitzkrieg keeps its terrifying momentum. The fragile Allied perimeter breaks open long before the Royal Navy can coordinate its rescue fleet. Evacuation routes are severed before the civilian rescue effort even begins. The Royal Navy might still try to launch its destroyers. The legendary fleet of civilian little ships might still brave the rough waters of the English Channel. But none of that bravery matters if the embarkation points are buried under a relentless, point-blank hail of tank fire. The historical rescue was already a desperate, chaotic gamble. Civilian crews and naval warships had to dodge non-stop bomber attacks. Destroyers were ripped apart by torpedoes. On May 31st alone, 68,000 men were miraculously pulled from the surf. But that success hung by the thinnest of threads. A fraction more German pressure shatters those defensive lines. Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers don't make it home. They die on the wet sand, or they march eastward into POW camps. The Royal Navy would have kept fighting to save whoever they could, but it wouldn't have been enough, not even close. Instead of a battered but surviving army coming home to rebuild, Britain is left with nothing but ghosts and empty barracks. With the army gone, the political fault lines in London start to split wide open. The real battle for survival wasn't just on the beaches. It was happening behind closed doors at 10 Downing Street. Between May 26th and May 28th, the British War Cabinet held 9 excruciatingly tense meetings. Inside that room, the immense pressure is breaking men. Lord Halifax is demanding negotiations with Mussolini to buy peace. Halifax, the aristocratic foreign secretary, is convinced that Britain's military position is hopeless. He looks at the maps. He watches the collapsing French army. He sees a mathematical certainty of defeat. He forcefully demands a reality check. He wants to know Hitler's terms before German bombers reduce the homeland to ash. He wants to use the Italian dictator as a diplomatic intermediary. Halifax's diary entries from these terrifying days reveal a man paralyzed by the looming disaster. He recorded his profound belief that the French were already defeated. He believed Britain's military position was shattered. Inside the tense confines of the cabinet room, Halifax made his case bluntly. He told his colleagues, "We must not ignore the fact that we may get better terms before France goes out of the war and our aircraft factories are bombed to pieces." Halifax is willing to offer up Malta and Gibraltar. He will surrender parts of the African empire. Anything to keep the Luftwaffe out of London skies. He believes that securing a negotiated settlement before British infrastructure burns is the only responsible action left. Winston Churchill is fighting a desperate political battle to keep Britain in the fight. He knows that even opening talks with Hitler could trigger a rapid slide into surrender. The moment you ask a conqueror for terms, you signal fatal weakness. You destroy the morale of the public. You prove to the world that you are already beaten. Churchill passionately argues that nations which go down fighting rise again. Those which surrender tamely are finished. He insists that Hitler's terms would be absolute. They would demand a puppet government in London. They would strip the Royal Navy. They would mean the immediate end of British independence. The tension in those cabinet meetings is explosive. Shouting matches break out. Cold stares are exchanged. The constant threat of government collapse hangs in the air. Halifax threatens to resign if Churchill refuses to entertain diplomacy. If Halifax resigns, he brings down the fragile coalition government. He paves the way for a peace-seeking administration. The fate of the free world hinges on the opinions of men like Neville Chamberlain, the disgraced former prime minister who still wields immense power, and Clement Attlee, the Labour leader. Chamberlain is dying of cancer, yet his swing vote holds ultimate power. Had the BEF been captured en masse on the beaches of Dunkirk, that delicate political calculus changes instantly. The argument to fight on becomes an argument for national suicide. Chamberlain's deciding vote likely drifts to Halifax out of sheer national panic. Democracies do not survive military disasters of this scale. The public pressure to stop the bleeding becomes immense. The demand from Parliament to see Berlin's terms becomes impossible to ignore. Britain could afford to lose ground in Norway. It could lose ships in the icy waters of the Atlantic, but lose the BEF and the room to bargain disappears fast. Churchill might try to rally the public with soaring, defiant rhetoric, but his political leverage would be non-existent. Without an army, the war's trajectory shifts instantly from strategic resistance to desperate survival. The peace faction wins. Britain taps out. If the peace faction fails and Churchill somehow holds on to power despite losing his army, the military reality is still grim. One path leads straight to a humiliating negotiated peace. The other leads to an immediate, brutal invasion of the British mainland. An invasion means relentless air raids. It means a tightening, suffocating naval blockade. And it means a ground defense fought by raw recruits desperately holding the line without heavy weapons. The RAF and its radar network would fight valiantly during the Battle of Britain, but Spitfires can't hold a physical beachhead. Air power can disrupt incoming bomber formations. It cannot feed a blockaded island when U-boats systematically choke off supply lines. Without those rescued troops, Britain loses its defensive backbone. It loses the irreplaceable institutional knowledge of a professional army. The hardened veterans of the French campaign are sitting in stalogs instead of training the newly formed Home Guard. Look closely at the home defense forces left behind. Even in our reality, with the men rescued from Dunkirk, the British Army had to leave nearly all of its heavy equipment behind in France. They abandoned 2,400 artillery pieces. They left behind 63,000 vehicles. They lost 500,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. The gear was replaceable, the men were not. Without the men to rebuild the ranks, the situation is terminal. Citizens are patrolling the coastal cliffs of Kent and Sussex with pitchforks. They are standing watch with hunting shotguns. They are drilling in town squares holding wooden dummy rifles. That pause at Dunkirk bought the BEF precious time. Without it, the perimeter collapses and the army is erased. That total collapse changes everything Germany does next. Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious invasion of Britain, was a massive logistical gamble. But Hitler wouldn't need to put boots on the ground to win. He employs relentless terror bombing from the Luftwaffe. He orders total submarine blockades, severing the Atlantic lifelines. He enforces starvation and isolation. Hitler would slowly, methodically strangle the British economy into submission. The moment Britain is forced out of the war, the Atlantic becomes a German lake. Allied supply convoys lose their eastern ports. The United States loses its unsinkable aircraft carrier in Europe. Without Great Britain as a heavily fortified staging ground, there is no jumping-off point for a future liberation of the continent. For Franklin Roosevelt, the fall of the BEF would trigger an immediate strategic crisis. In the spring of 1940, America wanted nothing to do with Europe's war. The isolationist movement in the United States wasn't just a fringe political group, it was a dominant, suffocating force. Organizations like the America First Committee organized highly publicized rallies with tens of thousands of attendees. Prominent figures like aviator Charles Lindbergh championed the cause. Lindbergh publicly argued that Britain's defeat was inevitable. They demanded that America stay out of foreign entanglements and let Europe burn. Congress guarded its neutrality fiercely. They had spent the late 1930s passing strict neutrality acts that deliberately tied the president's hands. Roosevelt was politically cornered, especially in an election year. He was preparing to run for an unprecedented third term. His opponents were eager to paint him as a warmonger, rushing to send American boys into a European slaughterhouse. FDR could quietly maneuver behind the scenes. He could ship surplus weapons under cash and carry provisions. He could offer moral support through reassuring fireside chats. But he could not conjure up the political will to openly back a losing horse. If Britain falls or sues for peace after a disaster at Dunkirk, Roosevelt's Atlantic strategy vanishes. The eventual Lend-Lease policy relied on a single, uncompromising premise: keep the British in the fight so Americans don't have to bleed. With no British army left to hold the line, the political argument for sending billions of dollars in military aid across the ocean collapses overnight. Isolationist senators like Gerald Nye would have a field day on the Senate floor. Why send guns, tanks, and ships to a nation that is already beaten? Why throw American treasure into a lost cause? Why arm a country whose government might capitulate tomorrow, handing those very weapons over to the Wehrmacht? The isolationists in Congress would have seized control of the narrative. They would argue that Europe is lost to fascism, and America must retreat behind its two oceans and fortify its own borders. The U.S. still rearms. The Navy still grows to protect the Pacific against an expansionist Japan. But without Britain fighting a stubborn rearguard action in Europe, every step of global strategy gets exponentially harder for the White House. There is no British soil to launch bombers. There is no staging area for an invasion fleet. American industrial might has nowhere safe to land in Europe. The real prize for Germany at Dunkirk wasn't just destroying an army. It was permanent continental dominance. With Britain neutralized, there is no D-Day in 1944. There are no Army Rangers scaling the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. There are no airborne drops over the hedgerows of Normandy. There is no Western Front. The Nazi grip on Europe solidifies. It turns the continent into a heavily fortified zone, Fortress Europe, that might never be broken from the outside. This wouldn't guarantee a permanent global victory for Hitler, especially with his catastrophic invasion of the Soviet Union looming on the horizon. But it deals Germany a powerful hand. Without the British fighting in North Africa, the Mediterranean falls. Without the Royal Navy contesting the Atlantic, German industry works unhindered by blockade or strategic bombing. Britain is forced to the negotiating table years before America can fully mobilize its vast industrial war machine. That pause kept the beach from becoming a graveyard. If those panzers had kept rolling on May 24th, the evacuation of Dunkirk would have been a massacre, not a miracle. Those German tanks weren't just chasing retreating infantry through the French mud. They were running down Britain's last hope of staying in the war.